Chapter 6, How Should We Live? Morality and Ethics. In this lecture, we'll talk about the distinction between the right and the good, the difference between moral obligation and legal obligation. We'll talk about the four dominant ethical theories, as well as the difference between moral objectivism and subjectivism, why we should prefer the former, and a couple of outlier theories, including deep ecology and Mr. Friedrich Nietzsche. So first of all, what's the difference between the right and the good? Well, the right concerns what we're morally obligated to do, what we ought to do as a matter of morality and ethics. The good concerns what it means to live a life that is happy. And oftentimes, these two concepts are run together, and perhaps people often assume that if you live an ethical life, you'll also live a good or a happy life. That's, of course, not always the case. It could be the case that you're a person who is very, very evil, but is very happy. There are quite a few evil people in the world who have lived, who probably are quite happy and sleep quite well at night. We would hope that that's not the case, that they don't sleep too well, but I'm pretty sure there are. And I think it's also the case that there are people who are almost saints, who are very ethical, but are not happy, are miserable for whatever reason. Perhaps they're denying themselves different things that would otherwise make them very happy, but they think it's a matter of ethics that they deny themselves these different things. And so first of all, the right versus the good, obligation versus happiness, and the fact that these two things can be disentangled. Second thing to discuss is the moral-legal distinction. Just because something is morally permissible doesn't mean it's legally permissible. Just because something is morally forbidden doesn't mean it's legally forbidden, and it goes the same way the other way around. And so, for example, for quite some time in this country, it was legally permissible to purchase and own human beings. But I would dare say it was never morally permissible to own human beings, because for lack of a more comprehensive argument, there's just a very simple argument. There's no relevant difference amongst human beings that would justify one owning another as they would a car or any other piece of property. And so notice that it was legally permissible to own persons, but not ethically permissible to do so. It's also the case that right now in 2013, depending on where you live, it's perhaps legally permissible to smoke marijuana recreational or seek out a physician-assisted suicide and actually achieve that physician-assisted suicide. Or, if you are homosexual, marry a person of the same sex. It's not the case that it's that way in every state. And so, surely it's not the case that if I land in Washington State, all of a sudden it becomes morally okay for me to smoke marijuana, but if I get on a plane and I fly to Arkansas when I get off the plane, all of a sudden it becomes immoral for me to smoke marijuana. Surely the ethics of smoking marijuana, or marrying a person of the same sex, or achieving a physician-assisted suicide don't turn on where I happen to be as a matter of physical location. Surely it's not the case that there's something magically special about Washington and Arkansas that have some huge, deep impact on this moral issue. So we want to distinguish between legal permissibility and legal obligation, distinguish that from moral permissibility and moral obligation. Don't make the mistake of conflating those together. All right, so now a brief word on the four dominant ethical theories. And Solomon only covers the first three, but I'm going to add the last because I think it's a powerful and worthwhile theory that we should consider. And we'll talk more about these theories when we get to the next book, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do. But we'll go ahead and cover them briefly today. First of all, we have Kantianism, of course, advocated and articulated originally by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. And there are two main maxims, or two main tenets of Kantian ethical theory, and they are both formulations of what Kant called the categorical imperative. It's a fancy term you don't need to remember, but just remember this. The first part of Kantian ethics says that we ought to treat others with respect. Other persons, that is. Other normal adult humans. Why? Because they possess rationality just like we do, and so there's no relevant difference between us. Second, we should only do things that we could universalize. That is, we should only do things that we could endorse everyone else also doing in similar circumstances. For example, lying. I can't endorse everyone lying under all circumstances or at any time that it would be to their benefit, because if everyone always lied when it was to their benefit, the social convention of truth-telling would break down, and therefore whenever I attempt to tell a lie and get away with something, I wouldn't get away with it because no one ever believes anyone. Take, for example, after I get off work one day this week, instead of coming home, I go to Hooters and I drink a bunch of beer. But when I get home, say at midnight, and my wife meets me at the door, and she questions me as to where I've been and why I've not answered my cell phone all day, and tells me how worried she's been and how the kids have been especially rambunctious, etc., I may be tempted to tell a white lie and say, well, I had to stay after at work, and the cell phone died, and whatever. But Kant would say, Matt, stop and ask yourself, can you endorse everyone lying in a similar circumstances? Can you rationally endorse that? And if you did, what implication would that have on what you're doing right now? Well, of course, if everyone always lied when it was to their advantage, my wife wouldn't believe me when I tried to lie to her in this circumstance. And so I can't universalize lying, because if everyone always lied, I would not gain the benefit of getting away with going to Hooters and drinking beer that I would aim to getting by with by lying to my wife. Now, of course, I would never do any of those things, but that's just an example. That's Kantian ethics. Treat others with respect, only do things you can universalize. Next dominant ethical theory is consequentialism or utilitarianism. Consequentialism is simply the view that what makes an act good or bad, or rather I should say ethical or unethical, moral or immoral, is what consequences it produces. And utilitarianism is a special breed, the most popular breed of consequentialism, and it is the ethical theory that an action is ethical to the extent that it maximizes overall pleasure and minimizes overall pain. And so the utilitarian would say, Matt, you should decide whether or not to lie to your wife about this based on which decision, telling the truth or lying, will bring about the most pleasure overall. And so I could tell her the truth. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I went to Hooters. I drank lots of beer. I should have done that. She'll be immediately disappointed. We'll probably have a fight. But the long-term consequences of lying and saying I was at work, had to work over, if she were to find out that I were at Hooters, then the fact that I had lied to her would be far more damaging to our relationship and cause far more pain in the long term. And so a utilitarian would most likely say, Matt, you ought to go ahead and tell the truth. Next dominant ethical theory is virtue ethics. This is an ethical theory that's been around for quite some time. And virtue ethics is the ethical theory that says that we ought to follow the virtues and avoid the vices. And these are just the common attitudes or characteristics that you've likely grown up hearing about. And this would be virtues such as bravery, thrift, hard work, perseverance, etc. And we would avoid the vices, the corollaries or the opposites, such as slothfulness or dishonesty, etc., etc. So follow the virtues, avoid the vices. And the benefit of virtue ethics, argue virtue ethicists, is that it's able to rejoin the right and the good. That by doing these things, you're not only doing what you ought to do as a matter of ethics, but it'll also lead to a good life, to a happier life. And so there's one exception to the rule that I attempted to defend earlier, that the right and the good ought to be disentangled. The last ethical theory we'll consider is feminist care ethics. And this is a ethical theory that is self-named by self-identified feminist philosophers, and it came about in the latter part of the 20th century as a response to what feminists considered the male-dominated approach to ethics, which would be the Kantian consequentialist / utilitarian and virtue ethics approaches. And feminists emphasize the importance of relationships, and they argue that what makes an action ethical or not has a lot to do with how you're treating the different parties involved in the decision, to the extent that you have a relationship with them. For example, not only should I not lie to my wife, I shouldn't just ignore her phone calls and go to Hooters and ignore my responsibilities as a father and as a husband in the first place. And so, of course, Kantianism and utilitarianism probably say the same thing, but feminist care ethics would put special importance on the relationship that I have with my wife. They would be less concerned if I lied to a stranger or lied to an acquaintance or did something that didn't benefit a stranger or an acquaintance. But if it's my family, I've got a huge obligation to them. And so this is meant to fill in that gap that utilitarianism and Kantianism and virtue ethics potentially leaves in respect to how we treat our loved ones. So those are the four dominant ethical theories. Solomon presents ethics as group-based norms and morality as universal. Ignore that section. I think that's unnecessarily confusing and inconsistent with the way most philosophers think of ethics and morality, so just ignore that. We typically use the words ethics and morality to pretty much mean the same thing. It's almost circular to say ethics is doing what we ought to do and morality is doing what we ought to do, doing the morally right thing. But you know what we're talking about. These are one of those things that we don't have to fully articulate, or we can only articulate so far. Ethics is one of those things that we simply experience firsthand. We know what it means to do something that's right and wrong. No further explanation needed on that. All right, last, relativism, subjectivism, and objectivism. First of all, there is, in fact, great disagreement over what we ought to do. That's one of the reasons we have different political parties. Some people think that abortion is ethically permissible for a range of reasons. Some people think that abortion is ethical only for a very narrow range of reasons. And some people think that abortion is never ethically permissible. And these disagreements occur between people or among people who are equally intelligent and acting in a way that they're attempting to figure out what makes the most sense. The fact that there's disagreement, though, doesn't mean that ethics is a mere matter of opinion. Doesn't mean that it's subjective. Doesn't mean it's simply as subjective or subjective at all, but it doesn't mean it's like which flavor of ice cream is most delicious. So if I were to ask my wife, Lisa, which flavor of ice cream is most delicious? She might say vanilla. And if you were to ask me, Matt, which flavor of ice cream is most delicious? I would say chocolate. Well, Lisa and Matt can give different answers to the same question and both be simultaneously correct, because which flavor of ice cream is most delicious is a function of our individual taste buds. It's a function of our individual perspective, our subjective perspective. It is a matter of opinion in that way, because the truth of the statement, chocolate is the most delicious ice cream, turns on whether or not chocolate actually interacts with my taste buds and my consciousness in a way that produces the most pleasure compared to the other flavors of ice cream. When I say something like abortions for non-health related reasons after 8 months are ethically impermissible, if I say something like that, that's not the sort of statement that is simply like chocolate is the most delicious flavor of ice cream. And you would contrast that statement with someone else who might say that abortions are fully ethically permissible after 8 months of pregnancy for non-health related reasons. Sometimes people think that since there's disagreement, that means that ethical questions must be subjective. But take, for example, the question of whether life exists beyond the Milky Way. Equally intelligent scientists, looking at the same data with the same access to technology and such, have reached different conclusions about whether it's likely that life exists beyond the Milky Way. Sometimes scientists say that, yes, we have enough reason to go ahead and say it does. Other scientists, who are just as smart, looking at the same data, have concluded that, no, it does not. Well, that just because there's disagreement, that doesn't mean whether life exists beyond the Milky Way is a matter of mere opinion. It's not like those statements can be simultaneously true in the same way that chocolate is the most delicious flavor of ice cream and vanilla is the most delicious flavor of ice cream can be simultaneously true. So the point of this mini argument is that just because there's disagreement over ethical issues doesn't mean they're mere matters of opinion, just because there's disagreement over whether life exists beyond the Milky Way doesn't mean that that is a subjective question as well. Similarly, and here's another argument to shoot down moral relativism or subjectivism, or the view that it's just a matter of opinion. If you're a true moral subjectivist, if you really think that ethics is a mere matter of opinion, people who hold very extreme and what we would consider abhorrent moral views can't be criticized. If you think that ethics is a mere matter of opinion, imagine a person who says that I sincerely believe torturing babies for pleasure is morally permissible. If a person sincerely believed torturing babies for simple pleasure is ethically permissible, and you're a moral relativist and you think ethics is a mere matter of opinion, well, then there's nothing you can say to that person. You can just say, well, we disagree. But of course, if anything is unethical, it's torturing babies for pleasure. Surely. My goodness. That's just true on its face. That's not something that we have to defend or provide an argument. That's just something that's obviously unethical. And so those are two, what I think, very convincing and good arguments to shoot down moral relativism, or the view that ethics is a mere matter of opinion. First of all, just because there's disagreement doesn't mean it's mere opinion, and that's the Milky Way example. And second of all, well, there's a terrible implication of moral subjectivism, or thinking that ethics is a mere matter of opinion. The implication is people could hold very terrible, terrible views, and there's nothing we could say to them to criticize them. We just have to accept it. And of course, we're not going to do that. Of course, that's just ridiculous. Okay, there's two views in the book you can go back and review. One's from a guy named Friedrich Nietzsche, a very interesting character I'll let you read about. And also there's something there at the end of the chapter called Deep Ecology, which you also might find interesting. But to the discussion questions, question number 1. Explain and examine Rawls's objection to consequentialism, which is outlined on page 86. Go to page 86, read that objection to consequentialism from Dr. Rawls. be able to explain it in your response, and then evaluate it. Is that a good objection, a bad objection? Why? Second discussion question. Solomon makes a case on page 81 that ethics and morality can both be known and followed without religion. Is that the case? Do we necessarily need religion to both know what we morally ought to do and also to have motivation to do it? Those are separate questions. But think about that. Look forward to your responses. Thanks as always for your attention.